Hello and welcome to my review of Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Tarzan of the Apes was published in 1914, having been previously serialized in the periodical The All Story in 1912. This was a fairly typical process for most genre books of the era, having to prove their popularity in order to earn a book deal. It's certainly the way that writers such as Heinlein and Bradbury, who both acknowledged an artistic debt to Burroughs, made their way into the industry. Burroughs' most notable other series, chronicling John Carter's adventures on Mars, actually preceded Tarzan into print, but it would be Tarzan with its 23 sequels that would go on to be more successful, helped in part by becoming the precursor for what most people would recognise as a modern franchise, with Burroughs aggressively pursuing deals in other media such as TV and comics and movies. The impact is still felt in the modern era via a Tarzan-fronted eco-campaign in 2008 and various Disney adaptations. One is drawn to a 2010 interview with author Ray Bradbury, where he proclaimed that Burroughs was the most influential writer in the entire history of the world. Bradbury acknowledged the controversy of his own statement, and there are no shortage of critics of Tarzan or of Burroughs himself. Initial criticisms focused on Tarzan's similarity to Kipling's Jungle Book, Burroughs' simplistic writing style, but later criticism would focus on its troubling depictions of women and of Africans. Tarzan begins life as John Clayton II, and he's born on the west coast of Africa after his parents are stranded in a mutiny. After their death, Tarzan is adopted by Kala, a significant female in a tribe of apes, who give him the name Tarzan, which means white skin in their language. Finding his father's cabin and belongings, young Tarzan teaches himself to read from his own children's books. But never having heard English, he can't speak it. He also finds his father's knife, and outside of the cabin he learns to fashion a lasso from jungle grasses. These two tools he will use in his many duels with the various jungle creatures. Tarzan's place in his tribe is always a little awkward, and eventually comes to a head, and he's forced to kill the leader and become the king of the apes himself. A tribe of Africans also moves into the area, and Tarzan steals from them and antagonizes them and excites their superstitions. Then a family of white people are also stranded in the area following another mutiny. Among them is Jane Porter and Tarzan's own cousin, William Clayton. Tarzan provides various services to them without letting himself be known, and he also fights off the various creatures that threaten them, including Turcos, an ousted member of his own tribe. After a fight with a native tribesman, one of the party, Deano, is left behind by his colleagues who presume him dead. He takes Tarzan onto a French area of Africa and teaches him, among other things, how to behave like a gentleman. In the denouement, Tarzan travels to Wisconsin to win Jane's heart and to save her from something of a loveless love triangle between herself, his cousin, and a gangster called Canlan. The last words of the novel are a Fleming-esque promise that Tarzan will return for further adventures. Despite Tarzan's incredible and enduring popularity, critical acclaim for Burroughs is something of an elusive beast, and where it is found, it's usually qualified or faint enough to be damning, such as this effort from Brian Aldiss on Pellucidar. Burroughs in this novel writes about as well as he can, not well but serviceably. With Burroughs you have moderate fun. Aldiss also says that Tarzan is impossible to take seriously, but the world of 1912 is a very different place to the world of the 1980s when Aldiss was writing. The zoology of Tarzan doesn't really hold up to modern knowledge of the animals, their behaviours or their habitats, and critics scoff at the fact that Burroughs never went to Africa. However, Dante never went to hell either, and much less is made of that. Burroughs' defenders point out that his knowledge was based on the accounts of Victorian and contemporary explorers. And as the British Empire expanded in the Victorian age, there was a huge demand for travelogue and for the fiction based on it. The scale of this demand made explorers like Livingstone and Stanley national heroes and celebrities. But in truth, it wasn't always possible to tell the factual and the fictional accounts apart. Anthropology was still a new science, and where scientific methods existed at all, they were very changeable. E.L. Bleeder calls the biology of Tarzan embarrassing, but he concedes that it may have been based on the writing of the discredited Dr. R.L. Garner, in the same way that Burroughs' Mars owes much to the over-imaginative astronomer Percival Lowell. It's certainly possible that, for the era, Burroughs' Jungle came with a high degree of verisimilitude, if not accuracy. Though if I may refer to Aldiss again, Burroughs' Mars, his Venus, his world at the Earth's core, even his Africa, bore only the slightest tinge of veracity. Nobody appeared to mind. Tarzan's popularity proves the latter point, though at the start of the novel, Burroughs is certainly making an attempt at realism. The first page details the accounts that the story comes from: a drunk clerk, official records, and the yellow mildewed pages of the diary of a man long dead. Burroughs details that John Clayton Sr.'s mission, given by the very real Colonial Office, is to investigate the brutal treatments of the inhabitants of the Congo. This is, though not explicit, likely to refer to King Leopold II of Belgium's mistreatment of the local tribes. Burroughs then is referring to real places, real organisation, and real events in an effort to make his book seem more convincing. The transition from the real world to the more fantastic world of Africa comes with a really great hook. Here, John, Lord Greystoke, and Lady Alice, his wife, vanished from the eyes and from the knowledge of men. Not only is this a great lure to draw readers into the coming adventure, but it also marks a transition from the documented Western world, the eyes and the knowledge that feels real, to the fantastic world of Africa that feels less so. In Africa, the accuracy is less important because it's a very real attempt to anthropomorphise the land that the Claytons are stranded in. They came about off a beautiful wooded shore opposite to the mouth of what appeared to be a landlocked harbour. Before dark, the barkentine lay peacefully at anchor upon the bosom of the still, mirror-like surface of the harbour. The surrounding shores were beautiful with semi-tropical verdure, while in the distance the country rose from the ocean and hill and tableland, almost uniformly clothed by primeval forest. With its abundance of game and fresh water, the bosom of the jungle, then, is a fertile and sheltering place. Yet it takes on a new form when darkness falls, with Burroughs emphasising the hideous reality in the grim depths of that gloomy wood. Erling B. Holtzmark in Tarzan and Tradition writes at great length about Burroughs' use of polarity, and there's no doubt that in the jungle there are oppositions at play. The jungle provides both shelter and danger. It provides animals that threaten the Claytons, but also those that warn them of the coming danger. Deep in the jungle, the apes hold their dum-dum ritual. The open space was almost circular in shape. Upon every hand rose the mighty giants of the untouched forest, with the matted undergrowth banked so closely between the huge trunks that the only opening into the little level arena was through the upper branches of the trees. This hollow, found in the remotest, least hospitable part of the jungle, is the site of rituals likened by Burroughs to church and state, and while it's hard to deny there may be commentary in that observation, we also see this wild, inhospitable locale as the cradle of the apes' primeval society. This juxtaposition of the primitive and the modern is a recurring theme in Tarzan of the Apes, and the comparison is not usually a flattering one. It's an interesting stance, but not out of keeping with the historical context. There was a lot of anxiety in the previous 2 decades about the state of man. Certainly in the UK there was a feeling that the empire had passed its zenith, but those discussions expanded to encompass concerns about the state of mankind, and especially about the negative effects of urbanisation, which again was a far from new concern. Nordau's work Degeneration, for example, precedes Tarzan by 20 years. Despite the scoffing of his critics, Burroughs writes with a very modern zest, qualified with the, for the time, quite Victorian vocabulary. But Carla was of a different mind. In fact, she had not waited but to learn that Tarzan was absent ere she was fairly flying through the matted branches. This usage of ear and the unusual but seemed to belong in the mid-Victorian era, while the general busyness of the text, along with some cliffhanger endings to chapters, seems to be much more modern. In fact, it may remind readers of a modern text with a similar amount of critical scorn aimed at it, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. The first 3 chapters, for example, end with the promise of coming mutiny, of jungle beasts skulking and threatening the Claytons as they sleep, and with Clayton penning the last words his hand was destined ever to pen. In more modern times, the usage to ever pen might be slightly more common, but Burroughs' way avoids the split infinitive, which is a much bigger concern in those days than now. And it's actually interesting because you see, to a modern audience, this primitive modern dichotomy that Burroughs is working on is being played out in a way that he didn't probably foresee. It's these hooks that help generate the pace in Burroughs' novel, which his prose probably couldn't do on its own. It's both a strength and a weakness of Tarzan of the Apes, because it isn't formulaic enough to strip down its language to try and create a sense of excitement in its fighting scenes. While the scenes then do not elevate Tarzan above its usual pace is characterised by Tarzan's frantic and relentless movements through the jungle. Chapter 9, for example, includes Tarzan musing on jungle life, teaching himself to read in his father's cabin, spying on the migrating tribesmen, and watching as they build their new village. It also includes Prince Kulonga battling both Kala and Horta the wild boar. He's then in turn killed by Tarzan, who butchers his body and then muses on the rights and wrongs of cannibalism. Chapter 9 is just 9 pages long. Amongst this frantic rush, the arrival of the bumbling Professor Archimedes Q. Porter and his entourage feels like something of a hard stop. It also brings a sudden injection of humour that's mostly absent from the rest of the text and therefore feels a little out of place. Again, we have this interplay of the primitive and the modern, with the modern men completely out of their depth, and but for the intervention of the primitive Tarzan, they'd be unlikely to survive their first day. Their arrival, the result of another mutiny in exactly the same place, is coincidental to say the least, and critics like to bring up this recurring use of the same plot points. However, the repetition here marks the two key moments of Tarzan's life, his being stranded in Africa in the first instance, and then his transition into manhood, sparked as it is by a movement in his barely garbed loins by his first encounter with the professor's daughter, Jane. Their mode of arrival seems contrived if we're feeling generous, yet it also marks the division of the novel into two distinct parts. Holtzmark insists that the presence of chiasmus and parallelism in these books proves that Burroughs is drawing on the Greek literary traditions headed by Homer. I don't consider it an insult to suggest that the far more modern source is likely to be Stevenson and Verne. Richard Lupoff goes further, though he stops just short of accusations of plagiarism when he suggests the work of Edwin Lester Arnold is the most likely source. However, the list of writers that Blehler and Aldis claim were inspired by Burroughs includes some pretty big names too, including Tolkien, Heinlein, Bradbury, Lee Brackett, John Norman and Michael Moorcock. Despite this legacy, Burroughs' reputation is one of a purveyor of commercially successful fantasies with little literary merit. Burroughs himself rounded on one critic with the pithy, "I am fully aware of the attitude of many scholars and self-imagined literati towards that particular brand of deathless literature of which I am guilty." Burroughs proves then that he can be both witty and verbose when he wants to be, and Tarzan of the Apes reflects its creator. His style is one-paced, but it's paced well enough that very little of the book feels laboured or slow. In fact, it generally moves about as briskly as its protagonist does through the jungle. Language changes very rapidly, of course, so 100 years later, some variation in vocabulary or unusual usage is to be expected. There's nothing really in the text, though, that will make this challenging for readers. In fact, it was the accessibility of Tarzan of the Apes that drew the ire of some of its critics. Brian Aldiss constructs a lengthy metaphor about a world that has texts that inspire thought and reflection on one pole and texts that distract from it on the other. Placing Burroughs on the latter, he describes him as a seller of daydreams. However, it seems to me that Burroughs has plenty to say, and his most famous character is a conduit for much of it. Rumour has it that Burroughs was given a 500-word pitch for his story and replied with, "Only need one word, Tarzan." True or not, it is the figure of Tarzan that dominates this book. He's the preoccupation of his parents prior to his birth, and then Burroughs writes at length about his transition from boy to man. Even when he's absent from the action in Wisconsin, the advancing forest fire mirrors the trajectory and the consuming passion of the approaching Tarzan. Tarzan is the focalizer, the centre of all the action and narrative themes of the book. In the handful of scenes in Africa where he's not present, those that are compared against him. The efforts of Kulonga, the prince of the African tribe, in hunting both Kana and Horta are less effective than Tarzan's efforts, despite the description of his own rolling muscles and lightning speed. But the comparison comes after he kills Horta the wild beast. Kulonga cooks and eats its flesh. His methods leave enough wasted for Tarzan to feast also. Though Tarzan is shocked to learn that the tribesman has mastered the method of making fire, Tarzan would not ruin good meat in any such foolish manner, so he gobbled down a great quantity of the raw flesh, burying the balance of the carcass beside the trail where he could find it upon his return. While in far-off London, another Lord Greystoke sent back his chops to the chef because they were underdone. Burroughs goes further, comparing Tarzan wiping his hands on his naked body to his cousin's use of scented water from a silver bowl, from wiping his hands on snowy damask. Clearly we're invited to draw a comparison between the three figures. Kulonga has the beginnings of civilization. He has technology in his bow, and particularly in the manufactured poison that tips his arrows, and he also has ritual in the cooking and preparing of his food. Yet at the same time he's ignorant and wasteful. He's unaware of Tarzan's observation and leaves behind the bulk of what his efforts have brought him. Later in the text, D'Arno's horror at Tarzan's methods of consumption recall the words of the Victorian household advocate Mrs. Beeton. "Man is a dining animal. Creatures of the inferior races eat and drink. Man only dines." Clearly this is a viewpoint that Burroughs doesn't share, and he displays this consistently, the first incident happening towards the beginning of the text and D'Arno's observation towards the end. It's all part of Burroughs' examination of the primitive and the modern, the cultured and the wild. Tarzan himself can, in these circumstances, be seen as much more than a blank slate for simple wish-fulfillment fantasies as some critics suggest. Instead, he can be seen as a kind of exemplary figure, much like Nietzsche's Übermensch. The language here is quite explicit, emphasizing the superiority of his speed, of his musculature, of his intellect, and referring to him many times as a demigod, as godlike, a Greek god, or Superman. Tarzan predates DC Superman by 25 years, so the most likely source of this is Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Nietzsche's work would have been becoming controversial as Europe moved towards the First World War, and people were connecting his work to German nationalism. However, it was still influential. Tarzan is seen as an exemplary figure of what humanity can achieve with civilization seen as a corrupting force holding us back instead of driving us forward. This was not a new concept even when Burroughs was writing. As far back as the 18th century, there were discussions about the direction humanity was moving in. Rousseau, in his 1755 Discourse on Inequality, argued that progress was taking man away from its natural state, and while there were writers such as Condorcet who thought that man's progress was linear and constant, there are others that saw it as a series of cycles, and that modern civilization would inevitably collapse as the Romans had, and then slowly rebuild. In the UK, there was a lot of writing on this subject at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, and a consideration was that the British Empire had passed its zenith and that a decline in society, progress, and humanity was likely, if not inevitable. Burroughs, as we can see, is initially following Rousseau's concept. Clayton, Tarzan's cousin, is a far weaker specimen than Tarzan, and Burroughs lays the blame squarely at civilization's door. Tarzan, initially at least, lives a lifestyle very similar to that depicted in the discourse, wandering freely and grazing rather than building and planting. Eventually, though, Tarzan's path diverts from that of Rousseau's savage. Burroughs emphasizes his keen intellect, and discovering the books intended to educate him in his childhood, Tarzan teaches himself to read. His intelligence cannot be denied. Burroughs emphasizes the point regularly. He's a far cry from the me Tarzan, you Jane character depicted in later TV shows. There's a good dose of Darwinism here as well, though. Tarzan's intellect and his physique are the legacy of his father's own good breeding. However, they are honed by the savage jungle and not weakened by the effete institutions of civilization, as is the case with his cousin. As such, Tarzan isn't just stronger than his cousin Clayton, but he regards him and his companions, including Professor Porter, as ignorant and stupid. They are unable to adjust to the jungle, but under D'Arno's tuition, Tarzan masters a civilized world in just a matter of weeks, so much so that he succeeds in both worlds, while his cousin is portrayed as well-meaning but ineffectual in both. Tarzan, compared with his kin then, is representative of what humanity can achieve away from the enervating effects of civilization. I very much doubt that Burroughs was encouraging anyone to live the lifestyle of the noble savage, more that there are aspects of civilization that had gone too far. Tarzan's senses, like his strength, are ultra-developed because of his youth in the jungle. Burroughs tells us that this is a matter of development through necessity. In ordinary men, the muscles and nerves are present, they're just underdeveloped. Tarzan's sense of taste, though, is his least evolved. He could eat luscious fruits or raw flesh long buried with almost equal appreciation, but in that he differed but slightly from the more civilized epicures. Again, we see the consistency of the message from Burroughs, criticisms of a civilization distracted by aesthetics rather than focused on progress. His view on evolution, though, is rather more Spencer than Darwin, and he realized all this without malice or hatred. To kill was the law of the wild world he knew. Burroughs briefly served in the cavalry and would have had a little experience of the American frontier, the spirit of which he seems to be invoking here. As Britain was examining its role and anxious about its future, Burroughs seems sure about where the world needs to turn for leadership. Though I don't see anything in the text to suggest he was an Anglophobe, the opposite is true of anything. It's telling that the chapter entitled The Height of Civilization charts Tarzan's movement from Africa through Europe and onwards to America. Along the way, he learns a final, valuable lesson about civilization. In one of his children's books, he learns that man alone wears clothes and that none of the animals do. He considers that they must truly be a badge of greatness, the insignia of the superiority of man over all other animals. Yet having stripped naked to hunt a lion for a bet, he discovers how superficial and limiting civilization is, and how easily shed. This was the life, how we loved it. Civilization held nothing like this in its narrow and circumscribed sphere, hemmed in by restrictions and conventionalities. Even clothes were a hindrance and a nuisance. It is only the civilizing effect of Jane Porter that convinces Tarzan to return to D'Arno and the town. Artistically, this portrayal of human perfectibility is not without its faults. In modern media, we see a lot of these faultless characters that succeed in everything they do without any kind of effort, and quite rightly, they're treated with scorn. Yet Tarzan is not really in that sort of territory. He learns and practices skills for the most part. Discovering the rope noose by accident, for example, is not an example of someone immediately skilled at something, but Burroughs still can use it to demonstrate Tarzan's superiority, focusing again on Tarzan's cousin when he immediately sees the possible applications for it and resolves to practice it and put it to good use. It isn't simply a skill inherited from fresh air. However, I can easily see how he might become quite tiresome quite quickly as a character. There's never really any great possibility of peril to a man who is effectively a god among men, and Burroughs' narrator fawns over him at every opportunity, as do many of the other characters, with D'Arno musing that Tarzan may be the handsomest man he'd ever seen, and Clayton and the Professor both having embarrassing "what a guy" moments when Tarzan arrives in Wisconsin and immediately sets about rescuing Jane. Tarzan may well be a representation of Nietzsche's Übermensch, a demonstration of the perfectibility man can achieve away from the damaging influences, particularly the extravagances and weaknesses of an excessive or unchallenging lifestyle. But indestructible, flawless heroes are not terribly exciting by themselves, so Tarzan needs Jane to be in peril the same way Superman needs Lois Lane. Tarzan is never in any real danger. Even after the violent death of his father, there's no sense of that, and there's no kryptonite in the jungle. So quite simply, from a storytelling perspective, she's there because an adventure story needs somebody we care about to be in danger, because otherwise it all falls flat. Jane is there to give Tarzan someone to save as much as she is to be a romantic interest. Unfortunately, Jane is a permanent damsel, in mortal danger absolutely everywhere she goes, even when she's transplanted from the dangerous jungle to her own farm in Wisconsin. Under a modern lens, it will be an alienating attitude to some people, and it isn't the only one that Burroughs demonstrates. Despite this, the depiction of Jane is actually quite an interesting one. In Africa, her lot is to be under constant threat of rape or of being eaten by the local fauna, each triggering her only noticeable patterns of behaviour, fainting or emotional breakdowns. It's a very Victorian portrayal, underpinned by very Victorian attitudes. He wondered why he felt so great an interest in these people, why he had gone to such great pains to save the three men. But the girl, that was a different matter. He did not reason here. He knew that she was created to be protected and that he was created to protect her. The bloody duel between Jane's would-be rapist Turcos and Tarzan inspires both horror and admiration in her as she watches the primordial ape battle with a primeval man for the possession of a woman, for her. In civilized company, Jane's situation is little better, with her father effectively having sold her into a loveless marriage with a local gangster in order to fund his failed African treasure hunt. She, of course, is rescued from this too by the timely arrival of Tarzan. Yet, in this volume at least, the hero does not get the girl. She agrees to marry Tarzan's cousin Clayton, having given her word. However, there is much to be said for the civilizing effect that she has on Tarzan, her memory being enough to recall him from his final jungle stopover, and the first glimpse of her ushering in his adulthood and the change from ape-man to man. In the wild of Africa, Jane is a civilizing domestic figure, and this is seen most clearly after Tarzan rescues her from Turcos. Confused by her emotional reaction and his own amorous desires, Tarzan initially follows Turcos' example and carries her off into the jungle with similar intent. Of course, our hero comes to his senses and instead takes Jane to the site of the Dum-Dum. As the least accessible part of the jungle, this is a place of some sanctuary, but as we've seen before, Burroughs has also established it as the heart of what civilization is available here. In this place, Tarzan, with no example to follow, begins nest building by instinct. He leaves, returning with offerings of fruit that he leaves at her feet, and then making further trips into the jungle, he returns with the materials required and builds her a shelter. It's an interesting contrast to his father, who fashioned his initial shelter for himself and his wife off the ground among the branches, as Kulonga does when he's away from his village. It's also different from Kala's initial treatment of the baby Tarzan, whose mate implores her to leave the child in the grass to die. To sleep on the ground is depicted as dangerous. Only behind their palisades do the natives do so. Tarzan may be fashioning a crude copy of his father's shelter, built to protect his own young family, but when night falls, Jane sleeps inside alone. The bower he erects from the local flora, then, fits two definitions of the word. Symbolic, then, that Tarzan should prostrate himself at the entrance to this private and feminine place. In 1912, the position of women in society was under much discussion, and in the US and the UK, women were still campaigning for the right to vote. In Tarzan, while Jane has some agency and a little power, is very much from the masculine position that women shapes the world via their influence on men, and that civilization is built by men to protect and serve women. We even see a touch of this at the beginning when an ape attacks Lady Alice. The action moves from an ape charging to both figures being on the floor. The reader is sheltered from witnessing violence towards the female by the narrator's intervention. As seen in the contrasting methods of the civilized Clayton and the feral Tarzan, the extremes of civilization have an undesirable, enervating effect on men that makes them less able to provide for and protect women. One of the most frequent criticisms levelled at Tarzan of the Apes is that not all men are considered equal. Bram Wickerink, in The Untamed Image of the Perfect Savage, is forthright enough to call Tarzan openly racist. Bleeler describes the series as characterized, among other things, by strong racism, and Bradbury acknowledged the controversy surrounding Burroughs, even when he described him as probably the most influential writer in the entire history of the world. The strident figure of Tarzan dominates the novel, yet he is, as shown, more than man, far more than all men regardless of their race. Burroughs does not show either white or black people in a particularly positive light. The white people are generally mutinous, cutthroats, ignorant and or stupid. The exceptions are limited to Jane, Tarzan and his parents. Yet Tarzan, in his first encounter with the natives that move into the territory of the apes, sees a footprint that mirrors his own, distinctly separate from those of the apes. His books had educated him on the difference between man and the word that is used in the book, which I will not say. His books had betrayed but how different had been the dull dead print to this sleek thing of ebony pulsing with life. Clearly this can be observed as progressing away from a backward attitude of the past, Tarzan disregarding the old knowledge of his books in favour of the empirical kind. Yet at the same time the language can also clearly be seen as offensive, even allowing for the passage of time. For example, the word I've censored has changed usage over time. There were periods when it was considered better than the alternative, yet I doubt too many would appreciate any human being described as a thing, though connections of that to slavery would be erroneous because slavery had been abolished for some time by 1912 and Lord Greystoke's mission in Africa was to stop what is described as illegal slavery. Tarzan's first encounter with white people is troubling to him. He has learned in his books about the great power and achievements of white civilization, but observing the vicious behaviour of the mutineers abandoning Jane and Professor Porter, he considers these white men as no different from the black men, no more civilized than the apes, no less cruel than Sabor, the lion. Later, watching the professor and his cousin blundering in the jungle, Tarzan considers them stupider than monkeys, and muses that any past pride in his blood was unwarranted. In the French enclave, talk turns to the merits of lions. Are they brave or cowardly? Tarzan offers that the behaviour of any black or white person is not indicative of the race as a whole. Not exactly subtle, but clearly there is a degree of nuance in Burroughs' depiction of white people particularly. The depiction of the natives, though, is more one-sided. The three-way comparison that Burroughs makes places the black tribesmen between the ape society Tarzan was raised in and the predominantly white civilization that he yearns for, until he experiences it anyway. The apes had the early stages of a primitive society, a little language. When Tarzan discovers the natives' village, he is disappointed. He had expected to come to a city of strange houses on wheels puffing clouds of black smoke from a huge tree stuck in the roof of one of them, or to a sea of floating buildings which he had learned were called variously ships and boats and steamers and craft. He had been sorely disappointed with the poor little village of the blacks, hidden away in his own jungle, and with not a single house as large as his own cabin upon the distant beach. Burroughs seems to be erecting a hierarchy between the three societies and placing the natives squarely between the apes and the white men because, along with a smattering of technology such as the longbow and the manufactured poison used to tip their arrows, the tribe has rituals of their own. Some are based around superstition, with Tarzan's various tricks and raids causing them to leave offerings intended to appease him. Burroughs earlier connected the rituals of the dum-dum of the apes with those of the church. Here he interjects the natives into the same mix. However, most of the rituals witnessed by Tarzan or others are centered around cannibalism and the vicious torture that precedes it. As mentioned, there was still a market for this sort of tale from around the world, but here Burroughs is making a clear distinction between the black tribesmen and the white men. After Tarzan kills Kulonga, he prepares to eat him, as the ways of the jungles dictate. Yet something stays his hand. Tarzan recognizes Kulonga as more than a beast. To indulge in cannibalism would, according to the narrator, be against a worldwide law, yet the aversion to this is inborn in Tarzan, as are various other functions of etiquette and civilization, such as the bow he offers in Jane after his duel with Turquoise. But this is not so with the tribesmen, who consume people regardless of their race. The mutineers who abandon the porters to the jungle, however, they also engage in cannibalism. Lost at sea, they're driven to it by desperation. Hunger was changing them from human beasts to wild beasts. It's a choice phrase for Burroughs, immediately reminding his readers that, though white, these criminals are an affront to the race they represent in text. The attitude of the novel is that their whiteness makes them human, but their behaviour is bestial, and together with their wretched conditions, they're in danger of degenerating completely into wild beasts, presumably like the natives. After giving in to their cannibalistic urges, the crew of the ship eye each other like beasts of prey. The black tribesmen are repeatedly described in ways that liken them to beasts. Tarzan's first encounter with the tribe describes the low and bestial brutishness of their appearance, but further depictions expand this further to unrelentingly describe the natives as savage, vicious, cruel, superstitious, stupid, and cowardly. It's a harsh and grim depiction that Wickerink considers to have soured contemporary perceptions of Africa, and it certainly takes the edge off any attempt to argue that it's a more nuanced depiction than he suggests. Burroughs describes the mutinous but predominantly white crew of the Arrow as they were evidently no different from the black men, no more civilized than the apes, no less cruel than Sabor. It's a very similar description to the one that he uses before Tarzan witnesses the full horror of the natives' cannibalistic ritual. More wicked than his own apes, and as savage and cruel as Sabor herself. Out of context, you could possibly argue that by describing the white and black men in almost exactly the same way, Burroughs is saying how broadly similar we are, especially in our faults. Yet in context, I can't see this anything more than Burroughs implying that such vicious behaviour as the crew of the Arrow demonstrate is beneath them and stuff of lower beings. It's an unpleasant undertone to the novel. Tarzan of the Apes was something of a sensation in its time, and though I will not vouch for the quality of the whole series, it's difficult not to recommend this book. Burroughs' writing is of a higher standard than his critics would suggest. Tarzan swings from page to page without any kind of let-up in its thrills and spills. As Audist attests, blood flows thick and fast, and taken as Bleeler's fairy tale wish fulfillment, it's easy to read and it's fun. Against the critical consensus, Tarzan of the Apes, through its protagonist, has a lot to say on the condition of man, as well as offering commentary on the state of the period and the general direction that society was moving. The downside to the text is that it also represents some of the more difficult aspects of his era, and Bleeler describes the text as an embarrassing piece of cultural history. Enjoying Tarzan fully will require looking beyond those difficult or unpleasant attitudes. People interested in those things, though, will probably find Tarzan of the Apes to be a useful study, if not an enjoyable read. Brian Audist describes science fiction after Burroughs' peak as falling into two camps, the Burroughsian and the anti-Burroughsian, and he admits that the latter is less attractive. Burroughs had a huge impact on science fiction and fantasy, and for people who want to know why, Tarzan of the Apes is a good place to start. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this content, then liking, commenting and subscribing helps this channel grow. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.